I want to start with two texts before I get onto my sort of 9 reflections. The first is some of you may have read this. It's Stephen Collini's book on what are universities for, because at the moment, wherever you are in the UK, you probably feel beleaguered by governments, and there's no exception here. And often people are saying, what are universities for? And this issue is being sort of missed. And Collini's book, is a grand statement of what universities are for. The most important institutional medium for conserving, understanding, extending, and handing on to subsequent generations the intellectual, scientific, and artistic heritage of mankind. We are merely custodians for the present generation of a complex intellectual inheritance which we did not create and which is not ours to destroy. That's a grand statement, and in many ways, many would say absolutely, but we don't get that across enough. In the same book, he comments on the views perhaps of what you might call Daily Mail journalists or some politicians, when he says the background implications in the comments of some journalists and politicians is that many academics are little better than middle-class welfare scroungers indulging their hobbies at public expense. And I'm afraid there are people, quite a lot of people, who still believe that. So we need to worry about that in terms of, we need to talk about, the capacity of the sector and building the capacity. It is not just of individual institutions, it's actually convincing everyone, this is my experience for the last few years, convincing everyone that we are, as a whole sector, hugely valuable to the economy. And then the other book, one of the more recent management books, Gary Hamel's American, but he's actually from London Business School, What Matters Now? And there are two very simple messages in his book. I mean, it's a very good book. It's mainly about, it's written for the private sector. It's about leadership and innovation in the private sector. But it says some fantastic stuff about innovation, and it makes me think that universities are absolutely brilliant places at innovation and creativity in their core business of the academic work they do, but we're still not as good at innovation in running them and in how we lead and manage them. But one of the interesting themes of that book is that it tells us, I've noticed this for some time, and a while ago worked in the private sector, that more and more really top leading innovative companies are running themselves like universities. And we beat ourselves up sometimes, or others do, that there's something wrong with the university system and how it's led. But actually, really progressive, high-tech companies will run themselves more like universities. So that's my two texts. In terms of the 9 lessons, someone said, is this Christmas? So it's 9 lessons and 9 carols. Well, I do sing in a community car. I am a keen follower of Gareth Malone, but I am not going to sing 9 carols between each one. But I'm going to go very quickly through this. They cluster these 9 things. The top 3 clusters are actually about the core business the Leadership Foundation does, and indeed many of you are involved in, which is actually about leadership development itself. And what we learnt, thankfully quite quickly, and stuck to it, about how leadership development works well in higher education. 3 things. First of all, we decided that we weren't about doing things to people. So we didn't talk about our strapline being training this or developing that. Our strapline was about engaging with leadership at all levels. And I think that in this sector, leadership development is a kind of adult-to-adult dialogue. It's not a parent-child process at all. And people worried that we would come in and be managerialists and simply tell the sector what to do and bring private sector models. It was a process of engagement and dialogue. Secondly, our experience sector-wide, but it can apply equally in institutions, is that people learn leadership working within their natural communities and networks. And we have spent a lot of time working with networks. Wesden is a very good example of that. All the work that Terry's doing, the various networks within research leadership, the networks within the leadership of teaching, networks like the registrars, AHUA, the UHR, the Human Resource Professional Network, UCISA and SCONAL, Information Services and Library. We have developed a whole range of collaborative products. And my experience is that although it's sometimes hard and complicated to make collaborations work, they're very good places for learning. Thirdly, dropping down, self-awareness. We did actually bring Leadership Foundation, Daniel Goleman and 360-degree feedback to this sector. I had worked in other sectors that have been doing 360 feedback for years. Now, one or two of you might say we were doing it before 2003, but not many of you were doing 360-degree feedback on any grand scale before then. And in terms of our pedagogy, I always like the little saying, most of you will know it, you know, about how many people it takes to change a light bulb. Well, how many psychologists does it take to change a light bulb? And as you know, the answer is it is only one, but the light bulb needs to want to change. And this is, in a sense, what our pedagogy is about. The leader, the manager, the academic leader, or the professional leader needs to want to be in that space of learning. And the skill has been creating that context. The others are substance rather than process, and I'm going really quickly, because you know all of these, but let's just recap on them. If I take, on the left, competition and collaboration, enabling people to really excel, leading, whether they be at institutional, faculty, whatever level, but leading in a world that is both about competition and collaboration. And that is just getting more and more intense, that conflict. And I'm very pleased Leadership Foundation is still one of the safe places that very senior leaders come to in competition with each other, but are prepared to share. And the day we stop sharing as a sector is a bad day, in my view. Third space, that is taken as a phrase from probably one of our most distinguished researchers now. And that's Dr. Celia Whitchurch, who's done has just published her third book on this issue of the relationship between academics and professionals, academic leaders, professional leaders. And of course, her third space is that growing collaborative space between academics and professionals, trying to get away from the sort of stereotyped, it's the academics versus the administrators. And certainly, as some of you know, I did ban a word in the Leadership Foundation. Early on, I found that administrators were called, or professionals were called, non-academics. And no one should be called by what they aren't. So I tend to say professionals. But third space, and working on that's very important. And one of the next phases of our Innovation Transformation Fund is actually about the relationship between academic culture and change and efficiency. Moving on down, reframing the institution. I think a lot of universities are having to really step back and reframe themselves and start afresh of saying, what are we for and what is our purpose, and in the sense, if I can dare use it, what are our markets and so on, and the ability to step back and reframe the institution. A good example of that, we run a program called Strategic Exchange, where we take senior leaders into different places. And our most recent one was at Media City UK in Salford, which is where the BBC has set up. And the BBC is going through it's coming out of it now, but major crisis. If you go to Media City UK at Salford, high tech, fantastic environment, younger workforce. I mean, quite a lot of people did come from London, but in a sense they have created a new culture that is just different from the culture in the South in the BBC. They are going through a process of reframing, and I think many of us have to do that. I'll go to the other side, crossing boundaries, internal and external. That is about our ability to see across boundaries, and I still think that my experience of the last 9 years is one of the things we're most brilliant at in higher education is creating silos, and recreating them in different ways. And it's about leadership development is often about enabling people to see across those boundaries, to work together across those boundaries. I haven't made time to say much about it, but I've done a lot of, the only academic work I've done in my career is on the psychological contract, working with Professor David Guest at King's. And I've taken that term because in the sense that what that is that set of mutual expectations, reciprocal expectations that people have in any organization of each other. And I've taken it to into a sort of higher education context. And I think what we're seeing is a changing psychological contract between students, staff, and the university itself, stakeholders, certainly governments. I mean, we're obviously very much in the context of Wales today, but the other day I was in Scotland talking to the Scottish Funding Council. Wales may go this way, I don't know. The Scottish Funding Council, under orders from the Scottish government, is now saying outcome agreements. Every university has to have explicit outcome agreements on what they will deliver in order to get their money. And this is just an interesting, again, shift in that balance between government as one of these parties in the psychological contract and universities. We have what is the student? A customer, a co-creator, a citizen. Moving from comprehensive to perhaps more differentiated and distinctive institutions. I mentioned collaborative to competitive. I've mentioned a bit about the sector. I do think that the sector is becoming more fragmented across the UK, not just because of different devolved administration positions, but it is generally becoming more fragmented. It's moving perhaps more to a looser system than a sector, and we have to work to make sure we counteract that. And we are moving perhaps to being a little less trusted and therefore more challenged by external bodies, including governments, and moving certainly from being certain, quite definitely from being certain, which we might have been 10 or 20 years ago, to much more uncertainty. And that leads me to the last one at the bottom, which is taking a phrase, tight loose, used by Professor Charles Handy, one of the few British gurus of leadership, and that sense of you have to run a creative organization that in a way that is both very loose, that enables creativity, innovation. This is what universities are about. But actually you have to deliver the bottom line. And in my own career, it's interesting going to the BBC. I spent 12 years in television in probably the best ITV company that was Granada, and we actually knew that most of North Wales, even when there was this is still an ITV contractor in Wales, turned their aerials to Granada, but that's just an aside. But basically Granada was a very good company, but it got right that balance between very high levels of creativity and a good bottom line, and I think tight loose applies to higher education. But it does raise paradoxes, which is my last point, that I think one of the issues about higher education is we are not one thing. And external stakeholders, including politicians, will sometimes think we're just about turning a handle on teaching or whatever. We're in the public sector. No, we're not. We're in the private, and I think you need to go through that and ask yourself, where do you stand on the list? Because we're actually expected to be very conservative. We're a sector that's overall 800 years old, but we're expected to be radical. We are, of course, critiquing and being critical is vital, but we're supposed to be supportive. We are encouraged to be competitive, both nationally and internationally, but equally collegial. We assume our institutions are autonomous, but we're heavily accountable. And I think the balance, particularly in the devolved administrations, between accountability and autonomy is changing. You can hide in England more than you can hide in Scotland or Wales. And are we private sector? Are we public sector? The Treasury actually classifies us as private sector. But we are publicly accountable. We are excellent, but we have to be equal. We have to be entrepreneurial, but we have to be values-driven. We are certain about some things, but we're always provisional about others. We're traditional and innovative. And of course, let's not forget the hugely important internationalization context. We have to be local and global in the same breath. So that, it sounded a bit more like 9 lessons, but there were 9 at the heart of it. But I just think what I'd like to suggest is, this is not going to lead to questions, but I just think in the spirit of these events, it's good just to relate to each other around the table. Can I just ask you to spend 3 or 4 minutes just round your tables, responding to that, reacting to that, asking yourself what resonated best with you? A lot of it kind of comes round to how you do achieve an alignment in these paradoxes. I picked up some positive comments here that actually some of this is opportunities, and then you were talking about, for instance, in David's, how process of change can be an opportunity. But, you know, there's an opportunity to define a different kind of distinctiveness and so on in this complex new world. The student voice can be an important opportunity to kind of coalesce round, or the core of the student interest. And I think that what I picked up there was this point about that, yes, there are these paradoxes, and there will be things that will always be in conflict in an institution, but you can aim to get them in balance and acknowledge them, even though you will not remove them. But these are critical aspects, back to, and I'll finish now, the concept of leadership development, because the skill of leadership in higher education is about pulling off this extraordinarily complex balancing act that balances autonomy and accountability and devolved and central and so on. And so that, to me, in terms of the one lesson, is the critical one, is achieving that balance. Thank you very much indeed.